Welcome into another edition of the Pilgrimage Perspective. This is episode 6. Today we're talking not necessarily about a pilgrimage, but about a huge aspect that we talk about on pilgrimage. It's the family of St. Francis. Not much is known, at least while we go on pilgrimage and what we talk about. You touch on his parents a little bit, but we don't talk about his siblings. We don't necessarily always talk about his troubled relationship with his dad specifically. But we're going to go deep diving into that today. We're going to talk all about his relationship with his parents and maybe how his relationship with his dad actually might mirror our own lives and maybe some troubles we have within our own families. I have Sister Joanne Schatzline and Sister Mary Elizabeth Imler. We're talking about all that and much more right here on the Pilgrimage Perspective, and that starts right now. And welcome into another edition of the Pilgrimage Perspective right here on franciscanpilgrimages.com. I'm Andy Trado, two guests with me today, very special guests, talking not necessarily about a pilgrimage, but about very important aspects that we cover when we go to specifically Assisi and Rome. I have Sister Joanne Schatzline and Sister Mary Elizabeth Imler. They are going to talk about the family of St. Francis. And one thing that I found when doing a little bit of research about this topic is that his family is probably not far off from our own families. He comes from a family of 7 children. He's one of 7. You can always fact check me on this because I went through several websites and I don't know how many of them are completely accurate. But one thing I was reading is that it's so relatable. And one thing we cover on pilgrimage is how relatable Francis and Claire both are. And his family is no different. So for a little bit of a historical aspect and a little bit of background, we'll start with you, Sister Joanne, and we'll figure out a little bit more about Francis's family and the specifics. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Andy. My love for this place and its history and an introduction into the family goes way back to my university days when we had a very excellent professor that got us educated in the need to understand the history of a place, but then to break open that place and understand the dynamic of what's going inside of it. So I remember doing research about where was Francis born, and of course we always use that as a strategy when we're leading pilgrimages to suggest to our pilgrims that there are 3 different sites. And of course, you have to make a choice about where is the most logical place. And then that leads you into the historical research that lands you at the Chiesa Nuova, quite honestly, with a close link to the little, the Stiletto, the little place right down the street where Francis's nephew likely lived, and then we kind of come up with an idea about where things started and how they concluded in this whole thing. But anyway, out of that research, that really also took me into understanding who these family members were. And when you're in Assisi, you understand that there's very little privacy if you're walking down the streets, because they all live up on the 2nd level or 3rd or 4th level, but they keep their windows open, particularly for air. And so you can hear the kettles being prepared and banging on the kettles, the dishes being done, the aromas of meals that you can smell. And it doesn't take much to image what was going on in this family of St. Francis. So as I continued to develop my work on the family, this was one of the first places that I had to be prepared for on my very first leadership program as a pilgrim leader. And I was scared to death, I mean, you get critiqued by your fellow guides who, want to tell you it was too long or too short, or you didn't need to be that deep in what you shared. But over the years, I have learned that the place grows on you and you grow in your own understanding because it's the pilgrims that help break it open when we get to the site. And if you're truly listening to what they're saying, you learn and you learn different dimensions that start to make sense. So what fascinates me about this family is some research, and I'm just going to mention a couple of books that have taken me more deeply into an understanding of Francis's family. One of them is called Journey Out of the Garden, Francis of Assisi and the Process of Individuation. It's not that old, but it's written by Susan W. McMichaels. And in there, she breaks open all of the women that were part of Francis's life. And of course, that includes Claire, but it also includes Pica, the mother. And so she pulls you into this feminine dimension of Francis, and we know it plays out in his whole life. He's always using feminine terms, mother, sister, spouse, that kind of thing, which aligns with another book that I admit I have not read at all, but Francis of Assisi and the Feminine by Jacques Delarune is another book that helps us to interpret Francis in this family role. And then one that really influenced me most was Naked Before the Father by Peter Lang. It's a very expensive little book, but he studies the renunciation of Francis when Francis divests himself of his what do you call it? The dowry, not a dowry, his inheritance. And it's that research that looked at art, and Peter understands that Francis had more than one inheritance. He understands that there was the inheritance not only of his father, which was the cloth shop, but of his mother. She apparently enters into the relationship with his father as a widow and has a son named Angelo. And so all of a sudden, Angelo makes sense. And in the Disownment, in one of the earliest paintings, he sees Pica and Pietro together. And Francis is looking at both of them when he says, I will no longer, claim my inheritance. Now we understand in most of the art is just Pietro. But out of that whole understanding, I started to realize why Pietro was such an angry person, or we think of him as an angry person. And he is losing a tremendous amount if he is losing not just the inheritance of his that he's giving to his son, but this property of Pica now goes to Angelo. And Angelo is this adopted son of his. And so he watches all of this just fade away. It's a fascinating thing that made me think of Pietro in a different way. He lost more than a son. He may have lost leadership or authority over the property that came with Pica. And we don't know exactly what it was. But he also now has to look to Angelo, an adopted son, for handing over the cloth merchant shop, not his own son. And so that leads you into the drama of a family. So when I preach there, I often think about what did every member of that family give to Francis. I start out by saying this was your introduction was excellent. This is a very ordinary, and we used to say, and probably still say, somewhat dysfunctional family. We've got, an angry father. We've got a mother who is abused. I mean, one of the things that just leaps out at you in the readings that we share with the pilgrims is from an earlier biography, The Legend of the Three Companions, they call it. And when Francis is named John, where did that come from? Well, Pica's father and Francis's grandfather may have had the name of John. So he's gone to France. What does she do? She names him after her father. He comes back and changes that name. And then when she puts Francis in, when he puts Francis in prison later on in life, she frees him. And the passage that strikes me is heaping abuse on abuse. He beat his wife because she released him from prison. So those are two key things. Yeah, Andy.
Some of the more interesting things that I was reading is what you mentioned is that his father was gone.
Mhm.
and she kind of took it upon herself to have Francis give birth to Francis in the way that she wanted, in the
Mhm.
stable, very similar to how Jesus was born, to honor Jesus's legacy, I guess you could say. A lot of this is very much playing out like a 1950s set television show in a way,
Mhm.
which is weird to think.
Yeah.
Um, because from the stories that I've heard, the father was not allowed in the delivery room, only up until probably a couple decades ago.
Mhm.
And the woman got to choose what happened because, obviously it was affecting her. Um, and you have to wonder if that really affected, not Pika, not necessarily disobeying
Mhm.
Pietro, but almost just not necessarily doing what he would have thought would have been done. And then, obviously him coming back and in Francis,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, very interesting stuff. And that's the stuff that you don't necessarily hear. I mean, obviously growing
Right.
up, they didn't teach you any of this. Even
No,
on pilgrimage, we don't necessarily always have the time to teach this,
no.
which is why I think this is such a fascinating subject to
Mhm.
learn and talk
Mhm. Yeah, I'll just finish a couple of
about. Yeah, yeah,
pieces
yeah.
because I want Smee to come in. Um, but the other historical pieces are in our Pilgrim's Companion, there is the genealogies. And that is very enlightening because Francis obviously never marries, but he has two nephews who do. His Angelo has two children, Picardo, who never marries, and he becomes very involved in the building of this tomb church for his uncle. But the other nephew does marry, and you look at the names of those children, and they're all after a form of, well, maybe there's one that's after Pietro, but most of them are named after a form of John or Pica. What does that say? So, a lot of people are into genealogy, and all we have to do is turn to the genealogy
Right.
of Francis to get enlightened and then ask the questions. How would this be? And how did that all play out? And then this angry father who also taught Francis an immense amount that allowed him to manage among the papal um, interventions and the politics and his distaste for money because he saw in the shop how that lack of solid monetary understanding of the value of money always left the poor at the bottom end of what was going on.
I think
So
that's
that's just kind of what I would start with in my reflection.
it is interesting that obviously the relationship between Francis and Pietro obviously very strained for a majority of Francis's life.
Mhm.
Um, but like you said, there were lessons in there, whether Pietro meant to teach him that or not. Um, obviously the age old saying is that the root of all evil begins with money.
Mhm.
So very, very interesting insight in that Francis definitely learned from his father, maybe not exactly what his father wanted to take from him, but obviously denouncing his wealth.
Mhm.
And, yeah, that very interesting insight.
Mhm.
We'll move to Smee. We'll move to you and your thoughts and findings about Francis's family.
Thanks, Andy. And Joanne, thanks for setting it up. I had to follow in the footsteps of mentor Joanne, who introduced me to Casanova and this dysfunctional family. And where it took me was to try to understand how did such a wonderful relationship life of the evangelical life come out of that dysfunctional background that's there. And what a great grace for all of us to recognize, as you were saying, Andy, sometimes we learn what not to be from our family experiences that are there. A little thing that struck me, and honestly, I don't know where I read it or if I made it up, but in 44 years of Francis's life, about half of his life he spent as a son, and about a quarter of his life he lived truly as brother in that relationship there. And then I sense about an eighth of his life as mother. And it's been fascinating for me to kind of look through that. If you look from 1182 to about 1206 or 1209, when he renounces this relationship with his father, Pietro, he is truly son. Now, technically, we know from Fortini that that's the legality of all of that. But like I saw him as the son of Donna Pica. She birthed him, she baptized him, as Joanne said. When he was 5 years old in 1187 was the fall of Jerusalem. Churches were open all day and night, and the talk of crusades, I think, just penetrated everyone there. And I believe he sensed, being a son of the church, that there was a contribution that men would make to the church. I think truly he was son of Pietro, which we've talked a little bit about, that he wanted to please his father. But when he was a merchant at about 13 years old, I think he recognized that there were poor that were impacted by his father's merchant shop there, and that they were basically rich in some ways. We know the story of the beggar who comes into his shop, his father's shop, and asks for alms for the love of God, not of his father, but for the love of God. And I think seeing then this son of Pietro, a little conflict. So what is it like to be the son of God in that sense that's there? I think also when he was 16 years old and La Rocca fell, and it was a long war where a number of castles in the area were taken down, and finally La Rocca fell. I think he began to grow into the sense of being a son of Assisi. You know, you can see in his teenage years how important that is, and those relationships that begin to grow and ultimately end with the War of Perugia and that incredible slaughter at Calistrato, spending a whole year in prison and then another year convalescing back under the care of his mother. And I think there were some influences of that half of his life as son. But he goes out then after that, seeking in solitude a new life. What else was out there? And of course, we all do that. I talk to the college students and say, Francis is a great model because he's a seeker just like you. What do you want to be when you grow up? And it's not a place, it is a relationship, nowhere to lay our heads. It's not just a team approach to ministry. It's not just a communal structure. It truly is, I think, what the kingdom of God is all about, and for which Francis said people will be climbing over the walls to see how the ladies do inside there. So those were some of my reflections, I think, that Joanne kicked me into in the next level.
It is interesting. As you say, I think there is a level of dysfunction to probably everything. In some way, shape, or form. Even the most perfect family, there's going to be a crack here and there because that's just human nature. How can we take this experience of Francis and Claire, because clearly there were dysfunctions in her family as well, how can we kind of present that to pilgrims and help them, maybe if they're struggling through something like this, or like Francis did, past traumas in his relationship, it obviously affected him throughout the rest of his life. How can we help those who come on pilgrimage with us? How can we have them learn from this?
Yes, me and I were talking in preparation for this. We recounted the many times that we've gathered in the cloth merchant shop, which is down below the church. And in those times that we gather, after you have introduced them to the real family of Francis, to the real struggles, to the issue of perhaps abuse, greed, all of these kinds of things, we usually offer them a moment to share and bring names of people into that room. And it's stunning. I mean, I've been drawn to tears myself in that room at being in that quiet environment, surrounded by, a building that housed a real family, with an image of the Holy Family up on a wall, or I think it's a window, and some artwork that kind of pulls you in. You do that by entering into a prayerful opportunity for us to pray for our family members. And it's amazing what happens. I'm especially among the college students that I've had the privilege of being with. For many of them, it's just an avenue that takes them from thinking of Francis as a saint, as Francis, as a son a brother, as Mary Elizabeth so beautifully described, that there is a fragile reality in a family, and out of that fragileness, out of that dysfunction, out of that, sometimes you're pretty careful because you don't know what family experiences exactly people are in. But out of that all, God works. God is in that mess. God is in the midst. And it's on us to just open ourselves to the possibility that, just as Francis had a sturdy sense of direction that came to him in a lot of conflict, out of a lot of conflict, the physical conflict of war, or the conflict with his father, or hiding from him. He hid from his father. He knew that this reality, he could have been beaten himself, or he was imprisoned once for something that he did. Out of all of that comes this moment where you know that you are a son or daughter or a child of God. And that gives you the confidence to shrug off, or to try to let go of those things that strap us down and keep telling us something other than what God sees. God sees only good in us and supports that.
And that's a beautiful communal moment that you have. And I think that's very legitimate, and often happens, like Joanne, just very powerful. Sometimes pilgrims will come to you sort of one-on-one. And what I recommend is just what Francis did. Sit before the crucifix, gaze on that, and see, as Joanne just said from Claire's letter, that God only sees goodness in you. And allow that to just sort of wash over you, that experience that's there, to see Jesus as a human person, as brother, and to know that love that's there. I just think it's on a kind of a singular space to have them do that. And I certainly believe in the power of that, as Claire did, and as she recommended to everybody, gaze upon him. And grace will help us grow through that.
There's one more dimension that it's Murray Bodo that brings me to this. And Murray, in a book that he wrote a long time ago, there's a chapter in there where he wants, like anything, to believe that Francis, this great man of peace, reconciled with his father. And we have absolutely nothing that suggests that happened. And that's an avenue into a conversation about how do we let go of the hurts that we've had? How do we accept the fact that maybe there's not going to be resolution of all the hurts that we've had? How do we deal with this whole notion of forgiving and letting go? And that is that's an even more fragile dynamic to carry with the pilgrims, but to know that even Francis struggled with that. And that sometimes there just aren't answers. It really humanizes the situation and makes you feel that you're not alone in having things that continue to hurt, having memories of things that you regret doing. And, there are different things that we've learned, those of us who have been able to go on retreats pretty regularly, learn different things that you share with people, such as, imagine yourself out in a boat, and what's this one thing that you really regret that you've done? Throw it out over the boat and imagine it going down to the bottom of the sea. And then the clincher is, when you come back, there's a sign that you see that says no fishing. You have to really let it go. You can't go back there. I'll tell you, personally, that's worked for me. I just keep saying no fishing. So it's things like that you do with people.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because there was a moment that I had in my first pilgrimage a couple of years ago, and I was sitting at the tomb of Francis, and Andre was the leader who was talking, and he was mentioning throughout the day, there are things that will happen on pilgrimage that you really can't explain. And I thought, yeah, okay, you have to say that. But there was a time where I was just sitting there, and all of a sudden I just started saying out loud the names of the people who I had problems with in a former job. And I thought I would never, ever forgive them, what I thought they did was just unforgivable. And without thinking, that is the thing that happened. I just started saying their names out loud, and I said, please, I was praying, and I said, please just, I can't hold on to this anymore. I'm letting it go now. And I haven't returned since then, which is crazy that is what happened.
Incredible grace.
It is.
Yes,
It was amazing to experience that. And I think a lot of people have that. In talking with Greg Masiello, who's one of our leaders for the Veterans Pilgrimage, I think there are similar experiences that he said he has witnessed both for himself and for the veteran pilgrims that he's went on pilgrimage with. Very powerful stuff, and obviously something that we can relate to Francis with yet again.
And I think that's the experience of pilgrimage, is you build a relationship even though you don't know these people, and there are grace moments that you can share with strangers who become a pilgrim partner, companion to their. Dismas Boehner has a line that says, intimacy is getting close enough to allow that person to change us. And I think it's a beautiful part. Again, Francis became brother to the Sultan, became brother to Claire. Somehow through that grace that you spoke about, Andy, he was able to open himself up sometimes to a stranger who becomes brother because they don't know all the baggage that you carry. And I think allowing ourselves to be open to intimacy, it's pure grace. Sorry, Joanna.
No, that's okay. I always hearken back to Father Rock, who was a very significant person in all of our lives. And he never left a place without talking about the place itself, the events that happened there, and then the spirituality. That's exactly what you were talking about, Andy. Andre echoed that, but it's that spirituality piece. And that's why we invite people to go back to those places, and we try to offer them an opportunity to do that before we leave Assisi. And I think that's what makes our pilgrimage experience so profound. It's not just the history. It's not just understanding what broke open in the place, but it's God's intent to have something happen to you that you're not even going to recognize, maybe. Or maybe that's the place where you will find yourself in tears and it will transform yourself. And I think that's the greatest privilege of being a pilgrimage leader, is to witness those tears, or have the people come to you to say, this pilgrimage changed my life. And it changes my life. I just get goosebumps when I think about it. And the minute that no longer impacts me, then I need to quit as a pilgrimage leader. But I've been at it 30 years now, and I rue the day that I can't be as graced by our pilgrimage experiences because of the people that we have the grace to be with.
You speak so beautifully there of the difference between a tour and a pilgrimage, Joanne, because on the tour, you're heading to a site or whatever it is. But on that pilgrimage, you don't know where that and when that encounter is going to happen. It is an awesome privilege. And you just take your shoes off and say, this is holy ground. This is holy moment.
Yeah.
It's so interesting that, the difference between a tour and a pilgrimage, when I tell someone who hasn't been on a pilgrimage what the difference is, they don't necessarily understand. But then we've had phone calls or emails or messages saying, I get it now. It's completely understandable. And while you can, the beauty of places in Rome and Assisi specifically can stick with you for a long time on a tour, how amazing it was and just how could this possibly have been built. But on pilgrimage, it's much different than that. You can take that. It's probably something that will happen. But I specifically remember where I was sitting when I was feeling this.
Exactly.
And that is, I think, the biggest difference between a pilgrimage and a tour, is that there are emotional changes that happen inside of you and make you, hopefully, a better person. And again, Francis is so relatable. The more I thought I knew a lot about him and how relatable he was before this. But in doing the research and talking with both of you, it's so interesting that the more pages and the more layers you peel back about him, you and me, we're Francis in the modern era in a different
That's
way, in our own
that's
way
it.
of
That's it.
going about it. And I
That's
thought, you know, most people are blessed with family members that you do not choose. But then there are people in your life, friends, brothers, sisters,
Mhm.
that are given to us from God. And that is another piece of Francis that I relate to, is that I love my family. My family is amazing, but then there are people that I just randomly bump into for whatever reason, and they leave just as big of an impact.
Mhm.
And it's amazing to think about, almost overwhelming to think about.
Yeah. And I think, you know, it again, fraternitas, it just challenges me. They're more than friends. You know, Jesus at the end of the life said, you know, I call you friends. But it was after the resurrection that he told Mary in John's gospel, go and tell my brothers and sisters, I'll meet them there. And that
Mhm.
to me is the resurrection. That's the Paschal mystery.
Mhm.
Andy, as you said, those folks become our brothers and sisters through the grace of Jesus, through the love. And until you experience it, you can't understand it. Even when you experience, you can't understand it. You can't always name it, and
Right.
it is powerful. It is. I wish it for everyone.
I do too. And it doesn't have an age limit. I mean, I'm blown away by the high school kids at what they come up with, as well as these 80 and 85-year-olds that manage to get their way onto a pilgrimage. And you can't make any assumptions about how God's work is going to happen based on who you are, your background, or where you're coming from, or if anything, I think that plays into, you know, what you're saying, Mary Elizabeth, about God's tremendous presence in our midst, and then the responsibility that we have. And yeah, I just love at the end to say, go home, because your job is now to do exactly what you said, Andy. We're supposed to be making a difference. And that's what happens. And that's why so many people come on pilgrimage with their workers, their co-workers, because they want to change the culture
Mm-hmm.
and environment, not only in their families, that's a side effect for them, but they want to change the culture within their ministries. And boy, I'm so eager to get back over there. You know, this pandemic is really, you know, and I think that's because it's such a holy experience for us as well.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. I went as a pilgrim myself, and then as sort of a leader when I was doing the videos project for the high school kids. Michael Ward, Father Alvin, our brother Michael Ward, Father Alvinte, and Jen Klecker were the leaders on that. And I sort of just was lumped in with the leaders. And we were all, you know, you're kind of, as a leader, you understand, you stand on the outside looking in. And yes, you're kind of puppeteering things, but you get to watch these pilgrims interact with each other. And a lot of times, as you said, they are complete strangers, especially on the adult pilgrimages. You get people from all over the world. And to see them after 2 days be closer than they were when they landed. And then
Quickly.
after a week,
Quickly.
see that they're so close. And then the tearful goodbyes you see at the end of 9, 14, 15 days.
Oh yeah.
It is amazing. If you introduced someone to the group, after 10 minutes, they probably would have thought, oh, well, this is a group that has known each other forever.
Yeah.
That's not really, it's never the case in many instances.
Or the delight of the leader being us,
right.
listening to our pilgrims explain to tourists down at some of the sites, and listening to them tell them about the statue, or tell them where they are.
Correct.
You know, I mean, that's the true gift that they give back, in how they then break it open for others. By the third day, we always say by the third day, you're going to be telling people where to go, and you're going to be telling others about what you've learned.
Absolutely.
I think one of the other graces just that struck me now is also the team that forms. I only get to do one pilgrimage a year, so I often am doing them with different leaders, and they always remark, "Oh my gosh, how long have you worked together?" And I'm like, "Well, this is kind of the first time we've done it together."
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
it is just
It's
amazing
true.
how you
Yeah, it's
click
so
with
true.
that, and because you put your ego aside, and
Yep.
it's all about the pilgrimage and just being poised for those graced
Mhm.
moments. But
Yep.
yeah, that's a great privilege to work with the team that John Shayla has put together for us.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, the grace moments that we've all experienced, we could talk
Mhm.
about forever. I want to thank both of you for joining me today and talking about Francis's family. And when I started this, I thought, okay, it's Francis's immediate family. It's his mom, it's his dad, it's his siblings, it's his brothers. But really, we all kind of learned, at least for me, that we're all a part of Francis's family. And we all are connected through Francis. And that is an amazing thing. Whether it's our leaders, it's our pilgrims. And in talking with our leaders, they miss that. I mean, I miss both of you. I miss being with you, and it might not be until we, wheels touch down in Assisi next year that we all will be together.
Yeah.
So it's these type of things that I feel blessed that I get to be a part of. And again, Francis is continuing to teach us certain things that maybe you never would have thought. So an amazing experience today to really
Thank you.
It's great working with you.
connected.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's
It's
wonderful. It's awesome. So it's part of the kingdom, huh?
Enjoying each other's spaces.
Yes,
Absolutely.
exactly.
Yeah.
Zoom is a wonderful thing.
Yeah. And thank you, Andy, for the
Yeah,
leadership
thank you for
you
your
offer on
leadership
this.
and
Really.
just the idea, pull it together. I've had fun just rethinking this again. So
Yeah,
I was
no,
so nervous because I thought I haven't done this in over a year and a
it's
half.
amazing to get to talk pilgrimage. And again, this is the scratch to the itch of pilgrimage, because
Yeah.
it's on a year,
Yeah.
it's 2 years now that I've been back. So yeah, thank you for allowing me a couple minutes of your day to get to experience.
Oh, God bless
Awesome.
you.
Thank
Have
you.
a great
Thank you both.
weekend.
Yes,
All right.
you too. Thank you very much. This
Peace
has
for
been
sure.
another edition of the Pilgrimage Perspective. Thank you both. We'll see you next time.
Peace. Bye-bye.
God
Thank
bless
you.
you all.